Good evening, everyone. We warmly welcome you all for the Remote Sensing for Mineral Exploration and Environmental Disturbances Analysis webinar organized by Society of Natural Resources, Faculty of Applied Sciences, Sabaragam University of Sri Lanka. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Nayani Ilangakoon. She is a research scientist at Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder, United States of America. She received her bachelor's from the University of Peradeniya. Then she earned her master's from the Bowling Green State University and the PhD from the Boise State University in United States of America. Also, her background is in remote sensing for vegetation application. Her research focuses largely on characterizing forest disturbances, recovery, and resilience, integrating cutting-edge remote sensing and in-situ data with machine learning. So I hope you got a clear idea about the background of our guest speaker. Before we proceed the session, I would like to remind everyone to turn off your microphones and videos to minimize the distractions during the session. If you get any questions, please keep them with you. You will be given additional time at the end of the session to present them. Now, we can start the session. I'm cordially invite Dr. Nayani Ilangakoon to conduct the session. Over to you, madam.
And before everything, good afternoon, everyone. Before I start everything, I would like to I would like to say thank you to Dr. Vanyarachi, who invited me for this talk. I consider this one as a privilege to me to share my experience and knowledge with you all today. And let me share my screen. Present the screen. Which screen do you see? Can someone confirm me, please?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah, so my talk today is titled as Remote Sensing for Natural Resource Exploration and Environmental Impact Analysis. So I thought I would share some of the analysis I have done in the environmental science field using remote sensing to understand different disturbances. And also some of the studies that not I involved with, but some of the other scientists are doing to understand natural resources and environmental impacts using remote sensing techniques. Because I'm not sure that how many of you are familiar with the remote sensing techniques, I thought maybe better I would introduce what is remote sensing in brief at the beginning, and then talk about some of the applications in environmental impacts and natural resource exploration, and also provide some of the free and open educational opportunities if you are interested in learning of remote sensing in your career or first, what is remote sensing? Actually, the remote sensing is that acquiring information from the targets of interest without a physical contact with the object. So in this remote sensing that we are using for studies, we basically collect information in the form of emitted or reflected radiation. So the radiation is energy, and so energy is transmitted as waves. So you may all familiar with the electromagnetic spectrum. And so the reflected or emitted energy that we are acquiring from the objects are passed as waves. So that waves can be represented by any place in this electromagnetic spectrum. It could be a gamma ray, or it could vary from gamma rays to the radio waves. And so they have different frequencies as well as wavelengths. Some of the energies are in the high frequency and some of the energies are in the low frequency. And so the objects that we are interested in having different characteristics, physical and chemical characteristics, and because of their physical and chemical characteristics, the energy that they are reflected or emitted also show different energy characteristic in this electromagnetic spectrum. So in this remote sensing, so we have to have some sensors that can acquire this emitted or reflected energy that are sensitive to some of the regions in this electromagnetic spectrum. In remote sensing, there are two basic types of sensors that we call them passive remote sensing or active remote sensing. In the passive remote sensing, so because we are collecting information that is reflected or emitted, there should be an energy source that passes the energy first towards the target of interest, and that energy then interact with the target and reflected back. So, and then in the direction of the reflectance, if we have a sensor, then it can capture that reflected energy. So depending on what is the type of energy source, we have two different types of sensors. One is the passive remote sensing, the other one is the active remote sensing. In the passive remote sensing, the energy source is the sun. So solar radiation is the energy source, and the solar radiation reach towards the targets and interact with the targets of interest. The target of interest could be mineral sources, it could be trees, it could be water bodies or anything. And then after solar radiation interact with that, when the solar radiation is interacted with the target, it could absorb some of the energy, it could transmit some of the energy can be scattered back or reflected. So we are collecting that reflected energy using some of the sensors. In the active remote sensing, we have to have an energy source separate from the sun that could be inside the sensor. So it emits radiation towards the target from the sensor and then interacted with the target and reflected back to the sensor. So there's no, it's not collecting the solar radiation. Applications, we have to aware of 4 different types of resolutions that we are using in the remote sensing field. And the information, the knowledge and information of these the resolution types are also important when we interpret the remotely sensed scenes or the images. So the first resolution type is the spatial resolution. And this resolution is actually the minimum resolvable unit that you can identify an object using remote sensing. So the spatial resolution is that the minimum spatial unit in the remote sensing scene that you can identify. So in the first image, it says that 30 meter pixels, and the second one is the 1 meter pixels. If you see a 30 meters pixel, that means that that's the minimum spatial area or 1 unit in that image scene. So the reflected energy from that scene is comprised of all the materials within that 30 by 30 meter pixel. So it's, for example, that could be in the ground. If you think of a scene that is covered by a 30 by 30 meter area, so that it may have some trees, it may have some portions of buildings, it may have some portions of water bodies, it may have some portions of bare ground. So the light interacted with that whole area is, the sensor is detecting the combination of all the reflections from all these objects in that scene. And in the 1 megapixels, the reflectance is represented by the 1 by 1 megapixel area. So when we use remote sensing techniques, then we have to think of like, what is the object type that we are interested in, and then whether that spatial resolution of the image seen is good enough for us to interpret that objects that we are interested in interpreting. The second, the resolution is temporal resolution. That is how frequent that the remotely sensed information are collected, the data is collected. Sometimes we collect the data at every second, sometimes like every year, sometimes like every few years. So this also tells you like how well that particular type of remote sensing techniques that can be used for our applications. The third one is the radiometric resolution. That tells like how many different values can be represented by a single pixel. For example, if it's depth of digitization, so if it's a 2-bit, then it has only 4 values. So each pixel can represent it of 4 different values based on its spectral characteristics. But if it's an 8-bit, it can represent like 256 values. So like if a particular pixel has different portions of targets, and then if you want to compare that to another pixel, if we can represent that many different values, then it's easy to compare than only a few values. And the last one in the remote sensing, the resolution type that we are talking is that spectral resolution. That is directly related to the electromagnetic spectrum that I showed you earlier. So this tells you that the sensitivity of your sensor to spectral frequencies. So some of the sensors are only sensitive to a few frequencies. So we call them the multispectral. So let's say if that sensor is less sensitive to only 3 frequencies. So it's the multispectral, and your image seen at the end, you will get only 3 bands, the data from only 3 spectral frequencies. And some of the sensors are sensitive to many spectral frequencies. So we call them hyperspectral. And so when you have more spectral sensitivities, that is good if you want to differentiate many objects in the scene. The other thing when we deal with the remote sensing is that we need to consider is that the sensor platforms. So remote sensing is collecting information without physical contact with the target, and we can have sensors at different platforms. Sometimes we can only have take the sensors, handheld sensors. We can take the sensors into the field and collect the information. For example, sometimes we get the water salinity. Some instruments we take to collect the information of water salinity. Or maybe there are some tower locations that people build the towers and put some sensors in the towers that can collect daily temperature measurements. These are ground-based instruments. And the next one is that the drone-based instruments. So we mount some of the sensors in the drones that collect information from about a few hundred meters from above the ground. And then the airborne platforms, that the sensors in the airplanes, they collect information from the target, maybe a few kilometers from the ground. And also, and the satellite remote sensing. The satellite remote sensing, the sensors are mounted in satellites, and they collect information from few hundred thousand kilometers from the Earth's surface. And why do we need to consider different sensor platforms is because that depending on the sensor platform, the area that can cover by the sensor also varies. How big the area that can cover. So for example, if you want to study individual leaf scale, how they are responding to different temperatures or different times of the day, what's the photosynthetic characteristics. then you might need to have some of the handheld sensors that can measure the photosynthetic capacity at the leaf scale. Sometimes you're only interested in different regions that you want to measure that biodiversity of that region. So you want to measure that how the trees are distributed in space. That can help you to understand the vegetation diversity. So you may have fly a drone because your study is limited to a smaller region. Sometimes maybe you want to do some studies across countries that's still maybe a nearby country. So maybe a one single country, the maybe carbon budget in that country, or the the deforestation in that country. So maybe you have to use a airplane-based remote sensing. And maybe if you want to analyze the climate variations, impact of climate change across the whole Earth, then you have to use the measurements that are collected across the globe. So you have to use some satellite remote sensing. So depending on your application, your sensor platforms can vary. And again, the disadvantage when the sensor platform can vary is that when you collect the information from the handheld instruments, you can collect very high resolution information. You are collecting information of a particular point, particular location. But if you collect information from satellites, the minimum resolvable unit can maybe represented by hundreds of meters. So you do lots of generalization of the scene when your sensor platform varies. And a little bit more about the passive remote sensing so I said earlier that the passive remote sensing is the collect the reflectance from the solar radiation. So when the solar radiation reaches to the Earth, we have in between the atmosphere, and the atmosphere has lots of different water particles, ozone, dust particles, and those when the radiation reaches towards the Earth, those atmospheric particles absorb some of the energy, and so the yellow region shows that the solar radiation in different wavelengths before it reached the atmosphere. So it says the top of atmosphere, and then the red region shows when it reached to the ground. So if we are analyzing scenes or the variation on the ground, these are the region, these red regions are the regions that we have available to sense using remotely. We can sense using remote sensing sensors. So if we want to build a sensor that can sense ground object, then you have to have your sensor sensitive to regions that is represented in this red wavelengths. So, and then when the solar radiation reached the Earth, Earth has lots of different targets, from buildings, roads, grasses, water bodies, forests, and then again, even within the forest, different types of vegetations, they all interact with the solar radiation differently, and then reflected back to the sensor. So if based on your particular object, when you build a sensor to extract information using remote sensing, then you have to select which part of the electromagnetic spectrum your sensor should be sensitive. And here is some examples of currently available satellite sensors. And there's gray regions show that the solar radiation that reached to Earth. And there's these different little colored boxes shows that each of different the sensitivity of wavelengths in each of these sensors. For example, in the Sentinel-2, there's a satellite sensor that is only have a few bands, few spectral frequencies that can be detected. Some are in the visible region, some are in the near-infrared region, some are in the shortwave region. So if your target is sensitive to some of these regions, and the images that are provided by the Sentinel-2 is good for your application. And again, I told you that earlier that we have a few different types of solutions. And again, based on like answer can be collected, again matters when you use remote sensing for your applications. So some are only sensitive to few frequencies, some are sensitive to a large number of frequencies. So if it's only sensitive for a few frequencies, your information will be collected only from that regions in the electromagnetic spectrum. And if they are sensitive for a larger number of frequencies, then you can have a continuous reflectance waveform. We call that spectral signature. So you can have a continuous spectral signature. The advantage of having a continuous spectral signature is that the spectral signature is mostly unique to the type of the target. You see really high reflectance during that 0.7 to 1.4 wavelengths. That's the near-infrared region. And it has a very low reflectance in the visible region, from wavelengths 0.4 to 0.6. And if you consider the snow has higher reflectance in the visible region. It has high reflectance actually both in the visible and near-infrared. But because now if you want to differentiate where the snow has and where the vegetation is at, so you could use this visible range where in the vegetation, the reflectance is low in the visible region in these two pieces. In the snow, the reflectance is high in the visible region. So if we have continuous spectral signatures, it's easier than the multispectral to differentiate the targets. And the second type of remote sensing techniques that I said, the sensor type is the active remote sensing. In the active remote sensing, I said that we should have the energy source as well. And because we should have the energy source, it is quite expensive to have the energy source, so it cannot have the many bands or many frequencies. Usually in active remote sensing techniques, we only use one wavelength or only a few wavelengths, or the energy source has only one wavelength, one particular frequency. So the principle is same, that it emits towards the target, interact with the target, and then reflect back towards the sensor. So the sensor, the information that sensor is collected in active remote sensing is a little bit different than the passive remote sensing. In the passive remote sensing, we collect the reflected energy as a spectrum. But in the active remote sensing, mostly they are recorded as travel time or the phase changes. Because this is an electromagnetic wave, so it propagates as a wave and reflect back as a wave. So the phase change, what's the phase change when it returns to the sensor is recorded, or the travel time, how much time it takes to travel towards the target and come back time is recorded. And then, so if you have the phase change or the travel time recorded, then you can, you know that the speed of light, using the speed of light and the travel time, you can calculate the distance to the target. And once you calculate distance to every target or every scene, every illuminated surface, then you can derive the structure of the target. So in the active remote sensing, mostly the deliverables are the structure of the target. It could be the target height, it could be the topography, So the surface characteristics, the surface structural characteristic. So we could use this active remote sensing techniques to sense the vegetation heights, the ground heights, or building heights, locations, etc. And so this is just to show that the current satellite sensors that are constelling around the Earth, and at this moment, and by the end of this year. So there are a ton of satellite sensors in this space that constelling around the Earth, collecting different types of information. And why do we need this many satellites? Is because that they have developed based on different purposes. As I earlier mentioned, that different targets are sensitive to different spectral properties. So when we build the sensors, they are built based on certain purposes. So they don't have all the spectral frequencies that they are sensitive. So they have only a few bands that they are selecting when they are building the sensor. So depending on what's the purpose of having a satellite, we had to have many different satellites have to be able to collect the information. And also from 1970s to 2023, the remote sensing field has advanced in many ways. So in the earlier that we have collected only very coarse spatial resolutions, only like few hundred kilometers per pixel. But now from the satellites, we collect 30-meter pixels, or maybe like few meters of pixels, 3 meters of pixel. The pixel size is 3 meters. So depending on the spatial resolutions and the spectral resolution, and also the radiometric resolutions, we have lots of different sensors built and collecting information. And you have the opportunities to select the data from each of these satellites for your studies. And they are, especially the NASA, they have now created open data form that they have to deliver data free for all. So you have the opportunity if you are interested using some of these data sets that they have. Now, in the remote sensing, what we get is that data. So we get a remote sensing scenes. So we have to interpret that scenes to see what information it reflects based on our objectives. So there are a few different ways that we can interpret these remote sensing scenes. One is that pixel-based interpretations or pixel-based characteristics. And then in there that we use indices or subpixel mapping. I will talk them in detail in later. And also there are some other studies that do, they aggregate similar features. So that is we call object-based characteristics. For example, if you have a image scene that is represented by 1 meter spatial resolution, and if you want to map trees, each tree has covered by many 1 meter pixels. So you have to aggregate the pixels that show similar properties. So that is called object-based characteristics. So the image interpretation can be done in multiple ways, as I earlier said. So one is the index-based characterization. So in the index-based characterization is that if we collect the spectral properties based on multiple wavelengths, then each pixel represented by the reflectance of each and every band that the sensor is collected. So you can build some mathematical relationship, the ratio or different equations can be used to relate different reflectances. And they are we called indices. So in this one, the normalized difference vegetation index is one very common vegetation index, or the that we use to identify vegetation properties. So that is, that index is that each and every pixel we calculate this ratio, the difference between the near infrared and the red, and divided by the some of the near-infrared and red reflectance. So in this map shows that the variation at pixel scale, the NDVI or the index that we calculated using the Landsat data. And so this tells that these different colors are based on the different values of the NDVI calculated. And this can tell probably about the vegetation density or maybe the type of vegetation across the space in that study area. In the subpixel mapping, I earlier told you that depending on the spatial resolution of the image seen, there may be multiple objects that contribute to the spectral signature, the wavelength, combination of the wavelengths. So if we have, maybe in a 1 pixel, we have the trees, we have the background, we have the buildings, we have the water bodies and everything. So our resultant spectral signature is the combination of all these properties. And the subpixel mapping is that, so at the end, we tell what are the percentage of each of those contributed materials within each pixel. To do that, what we usually do is that we find pure pixels. Pure pixels are the whole pixel that is represented by one particular class. With the bare soil, it could be just one type of vegetation, it could be just the water bodies. And then measure what is the spectral characteristic look like when it's only one type of material. And then relate those pure pixels, spectral signatures to the combined pixel spectral signature. See, like, what is the percentages, variation of percentages of each and different materials that are contributed to this mixed pixel. And this is the just image of the object-based classification. So in the image in the left side shows maybe a vegetation index calculated at the pixel scale. Image in the right shows the aggregate, the vegetation index or spectral characteristics, the similar vegetation index values, so similar spectral characteristics grouped together to represent different types of objects on the ground. In this one, they have classified vegetation classes: the corn, soybean, white wheat. I don't know what the WSG and CSV means, but different types of vegetation. They have categorized or grouped them in the scene. And the other thing is that the artificial intelligence. So in the two different types of the interpretation methods that I mentioned earlier, we need the remote sensing scenes, and also we need some knowledge and the data collected in the field that we can connect this information together. In this one, the input in the artificial intelligence, the input also a scene and the output also a scene. There's no that we don't collect or use in situ information. We use the in situ information at the end after we have the output to validate the output. But in the analysis, our input is image, a set of images, and the output also images. And there are some hidden layers in the artificial intelligence method that added some of the weight, some of the bias that you could manipulate different images that you input to build the output. So in the remote sensing, the other thing that we have to, with all this information that we already talked about, the resolutions, the sensor sensitivities, and then the active passive sensors, what type of information they gave, there's another thing that we have to particularly be aware of is that the scale of the problem that we are applying remote sensing. So, for example, if you want to analyze the climate impact, then you should be aware that from where your data is collected and what's the time scale that climate impact can happen. Like, for example, it could be decadal or maybe hundreds of years. And sometimes you may want to know about the phenology, that vegetation change with the seasons. So in that case, you have to have some data sets that represents that seasonal changes. So they can be collected every season, maybe every month, every week, like that. So when we use or select remote sensing for particular application, then you have to aware that what are the characteristics of the targets and how at what spatial scale they're varying and what temporal scale they're varying. Then select your remote sensing data sets that can represent those two properties. So next, that's the end of the brief introduction to remote sensing. And then now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we could use the remote sensing scenes for the environmental impact analysis. These are some of the studies that I involved with during past 8 years. So in this one, the first two studies that I'm talking are representing the vegetation structure and the plant functional types. So in the vegetation structure, when I say about the vegetation structure, you may now have some idea that what type of remote sensing that I have used in this one. Yeah, in this one I used active remote sensing because that gives the structure of the vegetation. It gives me the height of the vegetation. And in this one, I have used some ground-based light detection and ranging, or the LiDAR sensor that gives me the structure of individual trees. And in this study that I used that, I collected those data by myself and then delineate individual trees to see the photosynthetic capacity of those trees. The photosynthetic capacity changes based on the vegetation type and the vegetation stress, whether they have enough nutrition, enough water, or they may have undergone any different disturbances like the beetle attack or maybe the fires. So I use that vegetation structure information to delineate the photosynthetic capacity. Now, because it's a ground sensor, I can only collect like a very small area. But we have satellite sensors that collect the information seamlessly across a larger area. In this study, what I did was like I collected the information from small locations. And then I also collected some sensor information from Landsat data that tells, again, that can be, I used the vegetation index. That is the multiple vegetation index. One is the NDVI again, that shows that photosynthetic capacity again. So I build a relationship between, this is my ground photosynthetic capacity, and this is the photosynthetic capacity that Landsat has detected. And because that when the energy transmit towards the Landsat, we have the atmosphere and we have a lot of other factors that involved. So we have to count that how much that energy that Landsat is detected has been changed because of those factors. And then adding those errors, then I build I build a statistical relationship. Then I don't have to measure that photosynthetic capacity using the ground-based sensor. Now, because I have the Landsat sensor that collected all those information across the area, I can apply that statistical equation and then map the photosynthetic capacity. The second one is the plant functional types. The plant functional types are basically the different types of vegetation that have different functional characteristics. So in this one, we have like the different types of trees and different types of shrubs. So why do we need to understand that different types of trees or shrubs? Because that again tells you like what's happening on the ground in that particular study area. It tells you that the soil conditions, tells you the topographic conditions, it tells you that the radiation budget in that study area. And also we can relate those information once we have collected to the habitat, what type of animals we can see in this area, what type of microbial characteristic in that area. So in this study, I connect both spectral characteristics and the structural characteristic to see whether I can differentiate different types of vegetation. This study is functional diversity and carbon potential. Again, the functional diversity is that if we consider a particular area, what's the distribution of associations of different vegetation? I'm talking more about vegetation because my research mostly involves remote sensing of vegetation. Sorry about that. So in this one that I used, I took some of the active remote sensing data sets to see like how fires change the vegetation associations. So sometimes when an area is burned, the new coming vegetation is not same as the vegetation that was in that study area. So the environmental characteristics have changed. Once the environmental characteristics or the habitat characteristics change, the fauna and flora changes, and the microbial condition changes, and also the amount of carbon that ecosystem can hold also changes. So we could use different remote sensing techniques. In this one, I only use active remote sensing technique that measures the structure of the vegetation. And it tells that when the vegetation is grown, the structure changes, and that can help me to identify like whether that ecosystem after a burn is recovering, and if it's recovering, whether the ecosystem is gaining the same type of vegetation or the ecosystem is gaining different types of vegetation. For example, invasion. Sometimes like the vegetation species come back after a fire are invasive species that are not represented by that region before the fire. And another study that I'm doing with the remote sensing here is the night fires. So fires in the United States are very common. And so the fires with the climate warming, the distribution of fires has changed. And in this study that I'm studying, like where and why are the fires are changing? Usually that we all experience that nighttime is cooler than the daytime because we don't have the solar radiation. And so when there's a fire, the nighttime is usually helps to set off the fire because the temperature cools down and then all the water vapor settle down back. But with the climate warming, the night is also warmed. And sometimes because the night is warming, it's not easy to suppress the fires at night. So in this study, I'm using some of the, when remote sensing data is collected, they're not collected only during the daytime. There are some sensors that continuously collect in daytime and the nighttime as well. So we could use some of those data sets to see like, what is the impact of climate warming in the spread of fire, especially the night fires. And also there are a lot of other techniques that remote sensing techniques have been used for the environmental hazards. Here I'm showing some of the studies that have been used for arsenic and heavy metal content. This study have been only used the ground-based remote sensing. So you have to use some of the materials that you know that arsenic is having. So if you measure the spectra of the arsenic or another heavy metal, and then you go to the locations that you think that there's a arsenic or heavy metal pollution, then you can collect the information and then compare this information, see how much that area is affected by that heavy metal. And also another area of remote sensing for environmental hazard is the debris flows, landslide or erosion susceptibility. In this one, you have to collect the information from, this is the time series that you collect the information across a range of times. So you, and then especially the topographic characteristics. And then you measure the changes of topographic characteristics through time, and then maybe the slope changes, maybe the curvature changes in the land. And then you can use those features as indicators to map the susceptibility for different debris flows, landslides, or the erosion characteristics. The other one is that another satellite remote sensing based application is the water quality measurements. So because some of the satellites have some spectral frequencies that are sensitive to from the shortwave to the microwave region or the thermal region, then we use that information to measure the surface temperature, sea surface temperature, or the land surface temperature. And then the changes of temperature tells that the pollution And also some of the spectral characteristics are sensitive to chlorophyll content. So you could use those information to say that water pollution and also water salinity. So there are different sensors that measure those information from the space. MODIS is one satellite that give you those information. And the other one is the environmental hazard, like flood vulnerability. So sometimes we cannot use only the remote sensing techniques. Remote sensing techniques give you a certain kind of information, but there are other information that you have to incorporate in your analysis, especially the social census data. So if you analyze with the flood vulnerability, you could use the topographic layers that collected from the remote sensing data to tell that what is the if the rainfall is this amount, what's the area coverage by that rainfall. And then if you have the social census data, like the house intensity, then you can tell, like, okay, if you build a house in this area, what's the vulnerability of that house to be flooded? So remote sensing only, using remote sensing only, there are some studies can be done, but most of the studies you have to incorporate the other data sets to make it useful, make it meaningfully. You make use meaningfully. And there are other different areas that you can be used remote sensing in the hazard analysis, the earthquake damage or the drought occurrences. I'm not going through all of them, but just to give you some ideas that we can do that using remote sensing. And the forest or deforestation, and also hurricane and storms. And then the future of the environmental monitoring is that earlier we have only like sensors built by the rich countries to monitor their territories, but now we have sensors developed that monitor global scale vegetation structure, global scale temperature monitoring, and global scale agriculture, the coastal zones. There are so many different sensors that have built to measure the changes across the globe. And the natural resource exploration, this is just a summary of natural resource exploration, how we can use remote sensing for natural resource exploration. So again, it's very similar to the vegetation remote sensing, that different types of materials are sensitive to different types of regions in the electromagnetic spectrum. So if you know that what are the spectral characteristic of the materials you are interested, then you can use remote sensing to analyze them. So in this one, I'm showing like spectral characteristics of some of the minerals, like the hematite, the goethite, calcite, or kaolinite. And if you know these regions, then you could use remote sensing to map the mineral occurrences. Some of the ways that we use to explore mineral occurrences is the mineral indices, very similar to the vegetation index that I told about, normalized difference vegetation index. We can build the mineral indices that again build that some relationship between the reflectance of different bands that are sensitive to the different mineral occurrences. And then you can map the mineral occurrences using remote sensing. And also we can use remote sensing for geothermal resource mapping. So I said like some of the remote sensing, some of the sensors are sensitive to thermal region in the electromagnetic spectrum. And some of the remote sensing techniques can be used to measure the structure of the ground. So when we have the geothermal areas, they may be associated with the faults. So if you know the grounds, if you have an image that represents the ground structure, that can be used to delineate some of the fault structures, the directions, and where the faults occurs. And also we could use some thermal images to see that surface temperature. So you can connect those information together to map the geothermal, potentially the geothermal areas. This another one is that hydrocarbon mapping. So again, like minerals or vegetation, hydrocarbon also have some specific spectral characteristics. So if you know that those characteristics, and if your sensor can have information collected of those bands that are sensitive to hydrocarbon, then you can use that information to map the hydrocarbon occurrences or the seepage. This is another study done in 2015 to map the geothermal gold deposits. Again, this is the same principle that if you know the characteristics of the material, then you can use the remote sensing to map that. Sometimes you know the characteristics of the material, but your sensor is not able to collect that information. However, sometimes you could use other proxy measures. For example, when we have different types of vegetation, the vegetation types varies based on different types of soil as well. And different types of soil are made of different types of minerals on the underlying rocks. So you could use proxies of vegetation characteristics to map the underground mineral sources. So you can use those proxy measurements as well. And this is a study that in 2023, this is a very, this is global open pit mining locations. And you all are familiar with the Google Earth images that we mostly use for the Google navigation. So what they have done is that they have only used the Google Earth images. Now they are come with a very high resolution. So you can zoom in and then find locations where having the open pit mining. And they have mapped to show like where the open pit mining happens currently across the globe and what's the distribution across countries. And this again tells you like not only the current occurrences, but also occurrences of open pit mines, but also it tells you that where the mineral resources are distributed across the globe. And then this one, just to tell that, I told you that some of the sensors are basically developed based on the objective. And this EMIT is newest hyperspectral imaging sensor that's in the International Space Station. So it's collect globally hyperspectral signatures across the globe at 60-meter resolution. And the main purpose of this sensor is to collect mineral and dust sources. So they are basically built to map the natural resources across the globe. And this data also available freely for everybody. And it's the very newest, it's the newest sensor. Started collecting data from this year. So that's the end of that use of remote sensing for environmental impacts and the natural resource exploration. There are a ton of other applications that we can use the remote sensing. Only thing is that you have to like aware what the principles of remote sensing, what it is collected. And here I just want to show that if some of you are interested in using remote sensing to learn what is remote sensing or to use for your research or to build your career goal, these are some of the resources that you can download the data freely. The NASA, the ESA, the European Space Agency, the NOAA, United States Geological Survey, these are all the government institutions, but the data is free for everybody. You only need to make an account just to tell that who you are. And then the Planet is a private company that collects, has a ton of small satellites that collect information at high resolution across the globe. So they have some amount that freely download for educational purpose. So if you're interested, you can search that data as well. And then NASA distributed archive systems. So they also have archived some of the field data, some of the satellite airborne data, some of the field sensor-based data. So we could use for our research. And also the German DLR is the German Space Agency. They also have some of the data that we can freely download. The other thing is that education opportunities, so that everybody can learn remote sensing, and even though we do have courses or we don't have courses that are teaching remote sensing in our universities, anybody who are interested in remote sensing, these are the sources that you can learn what is remote sensing, how to use remote sensing data, how you don't have to have the software that you need to buy. All these resources are built on open source programming packages that you can learn from the zero level to download the remote sensing data, process the remote sensing data programmatically, freely, from freely available programming packages, the Python or the R. some of the packages. So one is that the institute that I am in, Earth Lab. So we have built free online courses for everybody that they can download, or they can follow the tutorials to learn the remote sensing from level 0. And the other one is National Ecological Observation Network. That is, again, one of the National Science Foundation in the US as funded agency that also has some tutorials how to use the active remote sensing data, how to use the hyperspectral remote sensing data in different programming. And they also have some freely available data sets that you can use for your training purposes. And also NASA RSET, again, this has a ton of training opportunities for everybody to use or learn different, from old to very newest remote sensing techniques. There are also like the opportunities that you can register for the events, workshop freely, that you can attend and learn interactively those techniques. And also the GitHub, you may already familiar with what the GitHub is. That's a free software or the code hosting package that you can share or host your own software packages. And also you could use someone else that already developed to use analyze some of the remote sensing techniques, so you can learn from them as well. So with that, I would like to end my talk, and thank you everybody for attending this one. And also I want to thank you, Dr. Nayani, for inviting me, and also all this institute that helped me to build my career in remote sensing, starting from University of Peradeniya. I learned remote sensing, started learning remote sensing 16 years ago from my first remote sensing teacher, Dr. Jagat. So yeah, with that all, I have to thank everybody. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, madam. Now it's the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please forward your questions using the chat box or turn on your microphones.
Hello, Nayani. Can you hear me, Dr. Nayani?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so it's very nice to see you, and after a very long time, actually. Anyway, it is a very nice presentation, actually. Our student.
Sorry.
Yes, Nayani. Please go ahead.
No, I just want to say that I forgot to tell that Dr. Nayani and myself are batmates, so it's great to see you too.
And so we are elated to see the presence
And
of
our students.
So
I missed something.
Yes, sorry for my connection is very slow. I am in India and the signal is very weak. Please, students, if you have any questions, please ask. And I think this is a very good opportunity to get and interact with this brilliant scientist. And I hope you know that in our universities these days are facing a big economic crisis, and in research purposes, during the research, we are lacking a lot of lab equipment and chemicals and many things. And this is another way of your thinking to build up your research when you are at the final year. So this is not involving a lot of expensive devices and Of course, it's involving some expensive devices like drones and satellites. But however, there are some data sets freely available. So you can do it very easily. So please consider that, and please interact with Dr. Nayani and get ideas about your final year research, or whatever. And I hope Dr. Nayani will help you even during the your final thesis level. Anyway, please, if you have any questions, please forward. Any question? Maybe ඔයාලට ඕනනම් සිංහලනුත් අහන්න ණයට වගේ තැන සිංහල හොඳට මතකයි.
Oh. Oh, I have to tell that if you have any ideas that you have that you want to incorporate remote sensing in your research, just email me. Dr. Wanyarachi has my email address. So please email me. And if you need any help on analyzing the data or learn of the remote sensing data, if you don't have access to any data sets or any publications that you want to read, just email me that I can help you in any ways that I can help you. I'm happy to help.
Dr. Nayani, can you explain how do we, is there satellites that we can use to analyze the forest cover and main environmental disasters, especially in Sri Lanka? Because, we don't have our own satellites. So in that case, can we use some other satellites available? That means data available in the NASA or other places?
Yeah. So the NASA's that Landsat constellation that started from late 1970s till today, we have the data collected across the globe. The only problem with some of the data sets that because the Sri Lanka is a tropical country, it's very humid and we have lots of cloud coverage. So when we use the remote sensing data sets, we have to correct the impact of the clouds. So currently there are some of algorithms that you have to apply, because when the NASA deliver the data, they don't have correct those information for everywhere in the globe. They mostly do that for their interest areas. But the data is available for over Sri Lanka as well. We have the Landsat data, we have the Sentinel data, and also I said like the newest sensors, three newest sensors that structure information, forest coverage, the forest height information that we can get from the JEDI sensor, and also the surface temperature or the water the evaporation stress measurements that can get from the eco-stress data. And also that the newest one, the EMIT, that I said that NASA has to map the mineral sources and the dust sources, that is again collect information across the globe. So all these data sets are freely available. The only thing is they may not have the processing, the data product processed, that they have processed the data over the US. But we can use, because there are already developed algorithms that you can correct some of the bad cloud coverage when we have over Sri Lanka. Yeah, but we have.
Students, if you have questions, you can ask questions either from English or in Sinhala too.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, Dr. Nayani and Dr. Wanwari, thank you for arranging this session. I'm one of the diploma students of gemology. And I wish to know, is there any help of LEADER technology to identify mineral sites?
So the LiDAR technology collects information of the structure. So if you know that the mineral occurrences are associated across maybe different fault structures, or maybe they are associated with different river patterns, or maybe they are associated with different types of vegetation, then you can use that technique. So the data is available, but you have to build a relationship between, mostly based on the proxy measurements, where the mineral associations can occur. Yeah, that's the way that you could use the LiDAR. But the JEDI LiDAR is available across the globe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
A little bit add to that question, I think some of the remote sensing studies have done for river basins in Sri Lanka to identify the gem potential. So I think Jagat sir has done some research in Monragal district. Yes, data is available. Only thing we have to do is
It shows me that the Zoom going to quit soon.
It's not like that, but I think I can correct it. Students, if you do not have any questions, we can wind up the session.
Okay, sir. So I must say we are elated to see the presence of so many lecturers of our department in this webinar. Dear sirs and madams, we really appreciate that. Before ending this webinar, I would like to thank our guest speaker, Dr. Nayani Ilangakoon, on behalf of the Society of Natural Resources. Madam, thank you very much for your exceptional contribute to our webinar. Your insightful and captivating presentation truly left a lasting impact on all the participants. Also, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Nuwan Wanyarachi, who did an immense contribution to this webinar by inviting today's guest speaker.
Thank you for having me. It's a great privilege for me as well to talk to you. And again, I said,
And the audience, thank you very much for staying with us. Good night, everyone.